Maya stood outside her apartment door, keys trembling slightly in her hand. The hallway was quiet, too quiet for a Saturday night, and her breath came out in short bursts, part nerves, part adrenaline, part guilt. She slid the key into the lock with practiced ease and twisted the knob slowly, like she could control how loud the betrayal inside her felt. The door shut behind her with a soft click. Darkness enveloped her for a moment before the smart lights flicked on. The white glow painted her living room in soft hues, making it feel sterile, almost unreal. She exhaled, kicked off her heels, and let them fall wherever they landed. Each step forward felt like an admission. Her purse hit the kitchen counter. She didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd done. It had started with harmless banter, then tequila, then hands where they didn't belong. She remembered his name. Barely. What she remembered more clearly was the way it felt to be wanted, without obligation, without expectation. Maya wasn't the cheating type. She had sworn she'd never be the person who crossed that line. But here she was, walking through the wreckage of her own morality like it was nothing more than Tuesday morning traffic. Her blouse stuck slightly to her back. The air in the apartment felt off, like it hadn't been hers for a while. She walked into the living room and froze. Music. Not loud, but definitely playing. Classical. Piano. Her playlist hadn't been touched in weeks, maybe months. She hadn't played this in forever. Her brow furrowed. A wine glass sat on the coffee table, still wet with condensation. She stepped closer. Red lipstick. Not her shade. Not her glass. A scarf was draped over the side of the couch. Beige, silky, and unfamiliar. She picked it up slowly, like it might bite. Perfume clung to it, floral, expensive, too bold to be her own. She stood still for several seconds, letting the pieces slide into place. Her pulse throbbed behind her ears. He had someone over. Her husband. Tonight. The realization didn't land like a punch. It was quieter, more surgical. It wasn't rage she felt, it was symmetry. She sat on the couch, eyes drifting toward the clock on the wall. 2:17 a.m. somewhere across town, hours ago, she had crossed a line. And here, on the very same night, he had too. Her stomach nodded. Not from jealousy. Not from fear. But from the sharp clarity that their marriage wasn't just broken, it was dead. Cold. Rigid. They were both pretending to love something that had already left the room years ago. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. The music. The scarf. The wine. It wasn't carelessness, it was apathy. She wasn't sure which one hurt more. Maya walked to the bathroom. Her reflection stared back, tired and uneven. Mascara smudged under her eyes, hair falling out of a lazy bun, red kiss marks trailing her collarbone. She looked like a woman from a story she used to judge. And yet, the emotion burning behind her eyes wasn't shame, it was awakening. This wasn't about one night. Not anymore. This was about everything they had let rot in silence. The dinners with nothing but clinking cutlery between them. The anniversaries acknowledged with generic texts. The sex that had become performance. The love that turned into habit, then duty, then nothing. Maya turned on the tap and splashed water on her face. She didn't cry. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The truth wasn't dramatic, it was exhausting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she removed the remnants of the night from her skin. Lipstick. Sweat. Regret. She stared into the mirror and whispered, "What are we even doing anymore?" There was no answer. Just the buzz of the overhead light, humming like a question that didn't need a reply. She didn't sleep. Morning light seeped through the blinds, indifferent to what had happened under its watch. Maya sat at the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, fingers laced tightly together. Her mind wasn't racing, it had already run its course. Now it was quiet. Sharp, but quiet. She replayed the signs she had ignored. Late meetings that didn't make sense. The sudden interest in cologne. Locked phone screens turned face down. The emotional distance she had chalked up to stress, work, life. But it wasn't life. It was disinterest. It was someone else. He had stopped choosing her long before she stopped choosing him. She walked into the bedroom. The bed was made perfectly, as if no one had used it. On the nightstand sat a note. Work trip. Back Sunday. Neat handwriting. No warmth. No suspicion either. He didn't ask where she was. Didn't accuse. It wasn't a trap. It was a transaction. They had quietly agreed to look away. There were no confrontations. No shouting matches. Only the sterile quiet of two people too tired to care. Maya folded the note once and slipped it into her pocket. Not to keep. Just to carry for a while, like the weight of what they had become. She used to think confrontation meant fighting, raised voices, slammed doors. But this was worse. Indifference. Apathy. The absence of care. They had mastered silence like it was a second language. Their last meaningful conversation felt like another lifetime. When had they stopped talking about things that mattered? When had they gone from planning vacations to sending each other calendar invites for groceries and bills? She couldn't remember. There had been signs. Missed glances. Shrinking touches. She had asked once if he was okay. He nodded without looking up from his phone. That was the last time she tried. Now she realized they'd both stopped showing up a long time ago. They still lived together, still shared meals, sometimes even laughed at old memories. But the present was empty. And the future? They hadn't spoken of it in months. She walked back to the kitchen, opened the fridge, stared at its contents without seeing them. She thought about the woman who had been here. What did she look like? Was she old or younger? Did she know he was married? Did she care? It didn't matter. Not really. What struck Maya wasn't jealousy. It was clarity. She wasn't mourning the woman. She was mourning the version of herself that waited. That made excuses. That thought this marriage was still something worth saving just because it existed. She remembered the first time she'd met him. He was charming, quick-witted, magnetic. He made her laugh so hard she snorted, and he didn't flinch. They had danced in the kitchen to bad music and promised each other forever. Somewhere along the way, forever had expired. Not in a blaze, but in a fade. She wondered how long he had been seeing someone else. How many times he had come home and kissed her like nothing was off. The thought used to break her. Now it just made her numb. He wasn't evil. And she wasn't innocent. That's what made this harder. There was no villain. Just two people who let the silence grow until it swallowed them whole. The apartment suddenly felt unfamiliar. The furniture. The pictures. The wedding photos still framed on the mantel, untouched. They looked happy in it. Probably were. Back then. Maya walked to the photo and picked it up. It was heavier than she remembered. She stared at her own smile. Bright. Hopeful. Naive. She gently placed the photo face down. It was time to stop pretending. She thought about calling him. About asking where he was, who she was, if he was ever planning to tell the truth. But what was the point? They had already said everything that needed saying, through what they did, and more importantly, what they didn't do. She didn't want apologies. She didn't need explanations. She needed to choose herself. For once. Fully. The sun rose higher, casting warm light on the hardwood floor. It looked almost golden. Beautiful, even. Strange how betrayal could sit inside something that looked so peaceful. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. There was no fixing this. Not because of the affair. But because they were done before it even happened. This was just the symptom. The root had died long ago. And now, she was done watering it. Maya sat at the dining table, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't sipped. The apartment was clean, still, and artificial. Like a hotel room someone pretended to live in. She looked around and saw the quiet emptiness she had accepted for too long. It wasn't just last night. It wasn't just the woman's scarf. It was everything leading up to it. She used to believe people grow together. Now she understood they often grow apart, slowly, invisibly, until one day they're strangers in a shared space. That's what they had become. Strangers who knew each other's schedules but not their dreams. Strangers who shared a bed but not their thoughts. She thought about leaving before. Not seriously. Just flashes. Moments during arguments, during the silence after them, during the long nights when he turned away from her and she stared at the ceiling wondering what she'd done wrong. But she stayed. For the house. For the memories. For the hope that maybe, eventually, they'd find their way back. That hope was gone now. Not because she didn't love him, but because she didn't love this. The version of herself that shrank to keep peace. The woman who felt invisible in her own marriage. The person who compromised so much that there was nothing left to give. She couldn't be her anymore. There was a time when she believed effort could fix anything. That staying was stronger than walking away. But staying in pain isn't strength. It's surrender. And she was done surrendering. She walked to the closet and opened the drawers slowly. The routine was familiar. Folded shirts. Pairs of jeans. Neatly organized socks. The life they'd built together, sorted by size and color. She pulled out a small duffel bag. Not everything. Just enough. She wasn't running. She was reclaiming space. Every item she packed was a decision. Not a reaction. Her favorite hoodie. Her journal. The necklace her sister gave her last Christmas. Things that reminded her who she was before this relationship took over her identity. She didn't look at his side of the closet. Didn't care what he would think when he saw the empty hangers. She had spent years worried about his feelings. Now, she had to worry about her own. Her phone buzzed. A message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. "You okay? Haven't heard from you." She didn't answer. Not yet. But she would. Soon. When she was ready to speak truth again. She thought about what she would say if he asked why. Why now? Why leave? But the truth was, she had no dramatic monologue. No final argument. Just one clear answer, because she had finally stopped lying to herself. They were no longer partners. They were cohabitants. Navigating a script they didn't believe in. Pretending love could survive on logistics and history. It couldn't. Not for her. She zipped the bag and placed it by the door. Her eyes scanned the apartment one last time. It looked the same. But she didn't feel the same. Something had shifted. Not broken, released. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was clear. For the first time in a long time. Her reflection in the hallway mirror caught her attention. Same face. Same eyes. But different posture. Upright. Calm. Ready. She picked up a pen from the counter and tore a sheet from a notepad. No theatrics. Just a sentence. "We stopped choosing each other. I'm choosing me now." She placed it where he'd see it. Not to hurt him. But to end the performance. Whatever came next, pain, confusion, rebuilding, it would at least be honest. It would be hers. Not something negotiated in silence, not something endured. Something real. She took one last breath in the apartment they'd shared. And then she stepped out. No tears. No goodbye. Just forward. The first night alone hit differently than she expected. Not painful, not peaceful, just quiet. A raw, unfinished kind of quiet that didn't beg to be filled. The air in her sister's guest room was unfamiliar but not unkind. There was space here. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to finally stop pretending. Maya lay on her back, staring at the ceiling like it held answers. It didn't. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like recovery. She didn't call him. He didn't call her. That said everything. The urge to explain herself came in waves. To justify. To soften the blow. But the truth didn't need dressing. He knew. Deep down, they both knew they had been over for a long time. They just hadn't said it out loud. Now she had. In the morning, she made her own coffee, stronger than he liked it, the way she used to drink it before compromise diluted her preferences. She scrolled through her contacts, tempted to reach out to friends she hadn't seen in forever. Not yet. She needed to get her footing first. This wasn't about appearances. This was about foundation. Her sister offered to talk. Maya declined. Not out of coldness, but because she hadn't yet figured out how to turn all the chaos in her mind into words. She didn't want advice. She didn't need comfort. She needed space to breathe without guilt. She walked through the park that afternoon. Not to clear her head, there was no fog left. Just to be somewhere that didn't hold memory. She didn't miss him. She missed the version of herself who used to believe love was enough. She mourned that girl. But she didn't want her back. Love wasn't enough. Not without honesty. Not without effort. Not without choice. She thought of all the compromises she had made. Things she'd let go of. The job offer she turned down to stay close to his work. The friends she distanced herself from to avoid conflict. The hobbies she shelved when they no longer fit into his routine. At the time, they felt like sacrifices made for the greater good. But now, they looked like erasure. A slow fade of identity, made polite. She didn't blame him entirely. She had allowed it. She had participated in her own disappearance. But not anymore. That night, she opened a blank notebook. Not to journal feelings, she had done enough of that in her head. She wrote one sentence. Who am I without him? Underneath it, she made a list. Not of what she'd lost, but of what she was about to rebuild. Her independence. Her voice. Her boundaries. Her desires. It wasn't a list of revenge or redemption. It was a blueprint. She remembered how people would romanticize staying through the hard times. As if endurance equaled strength. But she was learning that walking away from something that no longer served you wasn't failure. It was clarity. It was courage. She thought about love. What it should feel like. It should be safe, but not dull. Exciting, but not chaotic. Loving someone shouldn't require you to disappear. It should invite you to expand. To grow. To breathe. They had stopped loving each other in ways that mattered. The physical intimacy became habit. The emotional connection starved. They had stopped seeing each other, choosing each other, investing in each other. They weren't lovers anymore. They were survivors of a shared life that had run out of fuel. And yet, she didn't feel broken. She felt released. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. One where she woke up with peace, not panic. Where her decisions weren't filtered through someone else's needs. Where she could explore her own ambitions, take up space, make noise, without apology. The divorce papers hadn't been filed. Not yet. But in her mind, the separation had already happened. The emotional departure had occurred months, maybe years ago. Now it was just paperwork. Closure in ink. She didn't know what came next. Not in detail. But she wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. The scariest part had already passed, the decision to stop pretending. Now, it was about living in truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable, even if it was lonely. Loneliness didn't scare her anymore. Not like silence with him did. She closed the notebook and stared out the window. City lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to her transformation. That was fine. She wasn't doing this for validation. She was doing it for herself. One day, she'd look back and realize this was the chapter where everything began again. Not with someone new. Not with revenge. But with honesty. With healing. With herself. The message came 3 days later. Short. Can we talk? No punctuation. No warmth. Maya stared at it for a full minute before locking her phone. She didn't need to ask what he wanted to talk about. She already knew. Regret always arrives too late. She didn't reply. Not because she was angry, but because she had no questions left to ask. She didn't need clarification, didn't need to dissect the affair, didn't want the backstory. The story was over. She was done revisiting chapters that no longer served her. There was a time when she would have dropped everything to have that conversation. To hear his side. To maybe even forgive him if the explanation was just right. But that time was gone. She had spent too long waiting for him to show up emotionally, and when he finally wanted to talk, she had already walked away. She went back to her list. The one she'd started the night she left. It had grown. More than ideas now, actions. She had applied for a position at the publishing firm she once interned for years ago. Updated her resume. Reached out to an old mentor. She hadn't told anyone yet. Not even her sister. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming herself. Old friends started to reappear slowly. Texts. Voice notes. Invitations. Maya was cautious. She didn't want to swing from one version of herself into another too quickly. She needed to know who she was when no one was looking. That kind of clarity didn't come from distraction. It came from sitting in the discomfort and growing through it. Some nights were still hard. Not because she missed him, but because undoing years of emotional programming took effort. She'd conditioned herself to prioritize someone else's needs above her own. Now she had to unlearn it. That meant saying no more often. That meant not over-explaining her decisions. That meant trusting herself again, even when doubt tried to creep in. She revisited the memories on her own terms. Not to reopen wounds but to understand how she got here. The version of her that allowed small disrespect to go unchecked. That gave more than she received. That stayed silent to avoid conflict. She forgave that woman. She didn't judge her. She had done her best with what she knew. But she wasn't her anymore. There was power in seeing the full picture. The quiet nights of distance. The passive-aggressive remarks disguised as jokes. The subtle control disguised as care. It hadn't always been loud abuse. Sometimes it was just erosion, a steady diminishing of self-worth until love became a performance, not a connection. Maya recognized now that love without respect is just possession. And she refused to be possessed again. She started therapy. Not because she was broken, but because she wanted to heal right. She didn't want to carry bitterness into her next chapter. The sessions weren't easy. She had to admit how often she'd betrayed herself just to keep peace. But each realization gave her strength. Not rage, strength. She wrote again. Not for anyone else. Just for her. Essays. Reflections. Sometimes letters she'd never send. Words had always been her way back to herself. She hadn't written in years, not since he'd called her hobby a nice distraction. Now she saw it for what it was, dismissal. But she didn't need his approval anymore. Her voice was enough. The divorce was now a conversation she was ready to initiate. Not out of vengeance, but out of closure. The legal ending of what had emotionally ended long ago. She contacted a lawyer, not with fear, but with resolve. It wasn't a failure. It was freedom. She saw couples in the park, at cafes, on the train. She didn't envy them. Some looked happy, some looked like she used to, quietly trying to pretend everything was fine. She didn't judge them. But she no longer romanticized the image of a relationship just because it looked whole on the outside. Her worth was no longer tied to partnership. It was rooted in self-respect, in boundaries, in truth. She didn't need to be chosen anymore. She had chosen herself. That choice echoed through every decision now, how she spent her time, who she allowed into her space, how she responded to pressure. No more bending. No more apologizing for existing too loudly or wanting too much. When she finally responded to his message, it was 3 words. There's nothing left. She meant it. Not as a jab. As a fact. He replied once more. I didn't think you'd actually leave. Of course he didn't. She had trained him not to expect it. Years of forgiveness, of turning the other cheek, of silence, that taught him she would always stay. He underestimated the quiet kind of strength. But she wasn't the same woman who cried silently in the bathroom after arguments. She wasn't the same wife who accepted half-effort and called it love. That woman had burned herself out trying to fix what wasn't hers to fix. This new Maya? She knew her value. And she would never settle for less again. The papers were signed on a Tuesday. No drama. No final plea. Just initials, signatures, and the quiet thud of legal closure. Maya walked out of the office without looking back. It was over. Not with fireworks, not with collapse, just with clarity. There was no part of her that wanted to rewind. No nostalgia, no what-ifs. Regret didn't live here. Only growth. She hadn't spoken to him since the final message. She didn't block him, didn't rage, didn't dig for emotional reactions. That wasn't her way anymore. Silence was her boundary now. A silence born not of fear but of self-protection. She moved into a small one-bedroom near the bookstore district. Her own space. Modest, clean, peaceful. No memories in the walls. No shared history. Just possibility. Every item in the apartment was a choice, not a compromise. She chose warm lighting, not the cold overheads he used to prefer. She chose bold colors, not beige safety. She chose shelves full of books and plants and candles, things he once called clutter, now symbols of autonomy. Rebuilding wasn't glamorous. It was steady, sometimes dull. Grocery shopping alone. Fixing a leaky faucet by herself. Taking out trash without anyone to share the load. But every small task came with a quiet dignity. She was doing it. All of it. Without shrinking. Without deferring. The idea of dating didn't appeal to her, not yet. Not because she didn't believe in love, but because she was finally learning to enjoy her own company. Loneliness no longer frightened her. She had been lonelier in that marriage than she was now, even with an empty bed and silent nights. She began reconnecting with people she lost along the way. Some welcomed her back without question. Others kept their distance, unsure how to relate to this new version of her. That was fine. She wasn't chasing validation. She was choosing alignment. Anyone who didn't fit the healed version of her had permission to drift. Her therapist asked her, "What have you learned about yourself through all this?" Her answer came without hesitation. "That loving someone should never mean losing myself." That truth stayed with her, even on hard days. Because healing didn't mean every day felt easy. Sometimes she woke up with doubt. Other times, guilt crept in, whispering that maybe she could have done more. But then she remembered all the nights she cried quietly. All the times she begged without words for connection and got silence. All the ways she became invisible. There had been enough sacrifice. Now, it was time for investment, in herself. She volunteered twice a month at a local community center. Nothing major. Just helping kids with reading and writing. But every time a child smiled when they understood a word, she felt something inside her mend. She wasn't trying to fix anyone anymore. She wasn't rescuing or performing. She was present. That was enough. Her body changed too. Not dramatically, but in ways she hadn't expected. Less tension in her shoulders. Better sleep. She smiled more. Not performative smiles. Genuine ones. The kind that didn't need an audience. When people asked what happened to her marriage, she no longer offered long explanations. She simply said, "We stopped being right for each other." That was all they needed to know. That was all she owed. She deleted their wedding photos from her cloud. Not out of spite, but because they no longer belonged to her present. Those images captured a dream that didn't survive. And that was okay. Not every dream is meant to. She stopped trying to rewrite the past. Stopped needing him to acknowledge her pain. Some wounds you close yourself. Not because they weren't deep, but because you're done bleeding. Her self-respect no longer came from external praise. It came from the quiet knowing that she walked away from what was breaking her. That she chose truth over comfort. That she became her own rescue. She didn't need to be saved. She never did. She just needed to stop abandoning herself for someone who never truly saw her. A year from now, She imagined she would look back and barely recognize the woman who stayed too long, who begged in silence, who lost herself in the name of love. That version of her deserved compassion, but not resurrection. Now, she was living without permission. One morning, while folding laundry, a thought crossed her mind. Not a memory. Not a regret. Just a realization: she had survived. Not just the end of a marriage, but the erosion of self. The slow, steady suffocation of living half alive. Now she breathed fully. Not because everything was perfect, but because she finally understood: peace isn't found in someone else. It's built, moment by moment, when you choose yourself again and again.